August 14th, 1969, 2:17 p.m. The back training hall of Wing Lock Martial Arts Academy in Los Angeles sweltered under a broken air conditioning system, the temperature hovering near 93 degrees. Dust particles floated through shafts of sunlight streaming through high windows, and the smell of canvas mats and decades of sweat permeated every surface. Only 22 people were present when James Chen, a UCLA film student, set up his Bolex 16mm camera on a tripod in the corner, thinking he was just documenting a regular training demonstration. The camera's film magazine held exactly 11 minutes of footage. 9 minutes and 47 seconds would later go missing, cut from the original reel with surgical precision, leaving only fragments that raised more questions than they answered. But those who were there, all 22 witnesses, remembered everything the missing footage contained. The academy belonged to Master Yip Ching, a traditionalist who'd spent 43 years perfecting his Wing Chun lineage and had little patience for what he called theatrical kung fu. He'd invited Bruce Lee specifically to prove a point to his students, though what that point was would change dramatically over the course of the afternoon. Yip Ching stood 6 feet tall, weighed 195 pounds, and moved with the deliberate precision of a man who'd performed the same techniques 10,000 times until they'd become involuntary. His hands were calloused from decades of striking wooden dummies, his knuckles permanently enlarged, and when he demonstrated a technique, students could hear the displacement of air 3 rows back. Bruce arrived wearing a simple black training uniform, his hair still wet from the shower he'd taken after teaching his morning class. He was 28 years old, carrying 138 pounds on a 5'7" frame that seemed to contain more kinetic potential than physics should allow. With him came 3 students: Daniel Lee, not a relation but a frequent training partner, Ted Wong, who would later become one of Bruce's senior instructors, and Linda Lee, Bruce's wife, who'd seen her husband in hundreds of training sessions, but would later say this one felt different from the moment they walked through the door. The demonstration was supposed to be simple. Yip Ching would show his students traditional Wing Chun applications against various attacks, using Bruce as the attacker to prove that classical techniques could handle modern aggression. They'd agreed on this format over the phone 3 days earlier, a professional arrangement between martial artists who respected each other's lineage, even if they disagreed on evolution versus preservation. James Chen's camera started rolling at 2:22 p.m., the timestamp later verified by the sprocket holes that survived the editing. The first 47 seconds showed Yip Ching explaining the setup to his assembled students, 21 individuals ranging from teenagers to a 72-year-old man named Chen Wei, who'd trained in the same hall since 1931. Then, Bruce stepped onto the mat. The first exchange went exactly as planned. Bruce threw a straight punch, telegraphed clearly, and Yip Ching demonstrated a classical trap and counter, his hands moving with textbook precision. The students nodded appreciatively. The camera kept rolling. They reset, and Bruce attacked again, this time with a combination, still controlled, still giving Yip Ching the patterns he needed to showcase his art. 3 exchanges, all successful demonstrations, and Yip Ching's students were impressed with both their master's skill and Bruce's willingness to play the role of cooperative opponent. Then Yip Ching made a comment that would change everything. "You see," he said to his students, his voice carrying across the humid hall, "true Wing Chun doesn't need modification or adaptation. Mr. Lee has his innovations, but when faced with pure traditional technique, even he must acknowledge the superiority of the classical approach." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Bruce, who'd been smiling and cooperative, went very still. Ted Wong, watching from the sidelines, later described it as watching a house cat transform into a panther, not through any visible change in posture, but through an invisible shift in presence that made the air feel heavier. "With respect, Master Yip," Bruce said, his voice quiet, but carrying perfectly in the silent hall. "I don't think I've been attacking with any real intention. Would you like me to show your students what actually happens when traditional technique meets unrestricted combat?" Yip Ching's face darkened. His reputation, built over 43 years, had just been questioned in front of his entire school. "Please," he said, the single word edged with steel, "show us what you believe happens." James Chen adjusted his camera angle slightly, sensing something significant was about to occur. The footage from the next 4 minutes and 18 seconds would later become the most sought-after missing film in martial arts history. But the 22 witnesses provided remarkably consistent accounts of what transpired. Bruce reset his position, and everything about his body language changed. Where before he'd been cooperative and controlled, now he moved with the fluid tension of a coiled spring. No smile, no telegraphing, just readiness that made several students instinctively step back, even though they were already off the mat. The exchange happened faster than most people could process in real time. Bruce closed distance with a footwork pattern that seemed to ignore the space between them, his lead hand snapping forward in a straight blast that Yip Ching moved to trap using classical positioning. But Bruce's hand wasn't where it had been a microsecond earlier. It changed trajectory mid-flight, slipping past Yip Ching's attempted trap and stopping 1 inch from the master's throat. The sound in the room was complete silence. Yip Ching's eyes widened. He'd moved correctly, used perfect technique, and somehow his hands had closed on empty air while Bruce's fist had found the opening. They reset without speaking. The tension in the hall had transformed from respectful demonstration to something that felt like watching two grandmasters play chess at speeds that made the board blur. The second exchange was different. Yip Ching didn't try to trap this time. He used footwork, angling away while Bruce advanced, then countered with a chain punch sequence that had been drilled into muscle memory through decades of repetition. His fists flew forward in a rapid-fire blur, each punch theoretically setting up the next, the centerline theory in perfect application. Bruce slipped the first 3, redirected the fourth with minimal contact, and somehow appeared outside Yip Ching's guard, with his own fist, again, positioned precisely at the master's ribs. Not touching, just there. Undeniable. Chen Wei, the 72-year-old student who'd been training since 1931, would later tell his grandson that in that moment, he understood why Bruce Lee was trying to evolve martial arts. It wasn't disrespect, he said. It was necessity. The old master's technique was perfect, and Bruce proved that perfect wasn't enough against someone who'd learned to think 3 moves ahead. They reset a third time. Yip Ching's breathing had changed, faster now, the frustration of knowing his techniques were correct, but somehow insufficient, showing in the set of his shoulders. This time, he abandoned the purely classical approach and threw a low kick, targeting Bruce's lead leg, something not in the original demonstration plan. Bruce checked it, and Yip Ching immediately followed with an elbow strike aimed at Bruce's head. Real power behind it, the sound of his gi sleeves snapping audible on the camera's audio track. Bruce ducked underneath, and for the first time, made full contact. His palm struck Yip Ching's chest, not hard enough to injure, but with sufficient force that the master stumbled backward 3 steps, his arms windmilling for balance. The sound was like someone slapping wet concrete. Whump! The room erupted. Several students stood up, angry that their master had been struck. Ted Wong moved toward the mat, ready to intervene if necessary. Linda Lee remained seated, but tense, knowing her husband well enough to recognize he hadn't wanted this escalation, but wouldn't back down from it now that it had occurred. Yip Ching held up one hand, stopping his students. His chest bore a red palm print that would darken to a bruise over the next hour. He was breathing hard, not just from exertion, but from the psychological impact of having his worldview challenged in such a direct, physical manner. "Again," he said. Bruce shook his head. "Master Yip, this isn't what we agreed to. I didn't come here to embarrass you in front of your students." "Again," Yip Ching repeated, and there was something in his voice that made everyone present understand this had stopped being about demonstration or proof and had become about something deeper. A confrontation between past and future, tradition and evolution. The way things had always been done versus the way they might need to be done. They faced each other a 4th time. James Chen's camera captured every second, though this portion would later be cut from the reel so cleanly that film experts would testify the editing required professional equipment and expertise. Yip Ching attacked first this time, abandoning demonstration entirely, throwing full power strikes with 43 years of refinement behind them. His hands moved in the patterns he'd practiced 10,000 times, and they were fast, precise, technically flawless. Bruce made them look slow, not through superiority of technique, but through adaptation. Where Yip Ching's movements followed established patterns, Bruce's responses were improvisational, each defense custom-built for the specific attack. No wasted motion, no adherence to style. He moved like water around the strikes, and the witnesses later struggled to describe it adequately because it violated the fundamental assumption that martial arts needed to look a certain way to be effective. Then Yip Ching landed a strike. A straight punch that Bruce slipped, but not completely, the knuckles grazing his cheekbone with enough force to snap his head to the side. The sound was sharp, a crack that made several students gasp. A thin line of blood appeared on Bruce's cheek where the skin had split, and for a moment, everyone saw something that made Bruce Lee human. Pain, briefly visible in the tightening around his eyes before his expression reset to neutral focus. Yip Ching saw it too, and pressed forward, sensing advantage the way any experienced fighter does. He threw a combination, fists and elbows, forcing Bruce to give ground for the first time. Bruce's back hit the wall, and Yip Ching's next strike, a palm thrust aimed at Bruce's solar plexus, carried all his weight and intention behind it. Bruce wasn't there when it landed. He'd slipped sideways along the wall, and Yip Ching's palm struck painted concrete with a sound like a gunshot. Crack! The master's hand rebounded, and witnesses saw him grimace, the impact having jammed his wrist. Before he could recover, Bruce had closed the distance and swept Yip Ching's lead leg, while simultaneously pushing his shoulder. A simple judo principle applied with perfect timing. Yip Ching fell. Not hard. Bruce had controlled the throw even in the midst of what had become a real confrontation. But the master's back hit the mat, and the symbolism was unmistakable. A 43-year veteran of Wing Chun, who'd spent his life perfecting tradition, had been taken down by a 28-year-old who discarded tradition in favor of what worked. The camera kept rolling, capturing Bruce immediately kneeling beside Yip Ching, extending his hand. "Are you hurt?" Bruce asked, and there was genuine concern in his voice. No triumph, no gloating, just one martial artist checking on another. Yip Ching stared at Bruce's hand for 3 full seconds before taking it. Bruce pulled him up, supporting the older man's weight until he was steady on his feet. The master's wrist was already swelling where it had struck the wall, and Bruce immediately called for ice, which Linda brought from the small refrigerator in the academy's office. "Your technique is perfect," Bruce said quietly, wrapping Yip Ching's wrist with a towel full of ice. "Every movement was exactly as it should be, according to classical Wing Chun. But you fought me as if I was going to attack you, the way your style teaches people to attack. I didn't. That's not disrespect to your art. It's just adaptation to reality." Yip Ching looked at his students, all 21 of them, watching this moment with varying expressions of shock, confusion, and fascination. Then he looked back at Bruce. "Show me," he said. "Show them. What you just did, the adaptations you made, teach us." What happened next consumed the remaining footage on James Chen's camera. Bruce spent 23 minutes breaking down the exchanges, explaining not why Yip Ching's techniques had failed, but why Bruce's responses had worked against them. He demonstrated how he'd read the shoulder telegraph before the punch began, how he'd used peripheral vision to track multiple attack vectors, how he'd abandoned preset responses in favor of real-time problem-solving. The students asked questions. Bruce answered them with a patience that surprised everyone, including his own students. Yip Ching sat on a bench, his wrist wrapped in ice, listening intently as Bruce essentially deconstructed and then rebuilt martial arts theory in front of people who'd spent years or decades believing there was only one correct approach. The film ran out at 2:33 p.m., 11 minutes and 17 seconds after James Chen had pressed record. He changed reels, loaded fresh film, and shot another 7 minutes of Bruce teaching before Yip Ching called an end to the session, thanking Bruce formally in front of his students. They bowed to each other, the respect genuine despite the confrontation that had preceded it. 6 days later, James Chen's apartment was broken into. Nothing was taken except the 2 film reels. His camera equipment was left untouched. The theft was never solved, though Chen later received an anonymous package containing the first reel with 9 minutes and 47 seconds cleanly excised. The second reel was never returned. In 1975, A collector claimed to have 8 seconds of the original footage and began arranging a private screening. He died of a heart attack the day before. The film was never found. Yip Ching never spoke publicly about what happened that afternoon, but his teaching changed. Students noticed a subtle shift in his philosophy. He still taught classical Wing Chun, but he began encouraging students to pressure test their techniques against unfamiliar styles, to think adaptively. When asked about this change, he would simply say that a true master never stops learning. Ted Wong incorporated the principles he'd witnessed into his own teaching, becoming one of Bruce's most respected senior students. He spoke about that afternoon only rarely, usually to counter wild rumors that had Bruce performing supernatural feats or disrespecting traditional masters. Bruce proved a point, Ted would say, but he did it to teach, not to destroy. The footage went missing because certain people couldn't handle the cognitive dissonance of watching perfect technique lose to adaptive thinking. Chen Wei, the 72-year-old student, trained for another 8 years before age finally forced him to retire. He told his grandson that he'd learned more about martial arts in 23 minutes of watching Bruce teach than in 41 years of formal training. Not because my master wasn't skilled, he explained, but because I'd never questioned whether skill alone was sufficient. Bruce made us question everything, and that questioning made us better. Linda Lee kept her own notes from that day, handwritten observations about the teaching portion that occurred after the confrontation. These notes would later inform some of Bruce's philosophical writings about martial arts, though he never publicly referenced the Yip Ching encounter. When asked about missing footage or lost film, Bruce would simply smile and say, "What matters isn't what the camera captured, but what the people in that room learned." The search for the complete footage continues decades later. Collectors offer 6-figure sums. Conspiracy theories abound about who orchestrated the theft and why. The truth, like the footage itself, remains elusive. What's not elusive is the impact on everyone present. 22 witnesses saw martial arts evolution happen in real time, saw the collision between tradition and innovation, and saw 2 men handle profound disagreement with respect and dignity. Some became teachers themselves, spreading the lesson that perfection of technique matters less than willingness to adapt. James Chen eventually gave up filmmaking and became a teacher, but he kept the return real with its conspicuous gap, a physical reminder that some truths are too challenging to preserve. The missing footage exists now only in memory and testimony. Perhaps that's appropriate. The footage would have become artifact, endlessly analyzed, reduced to slow-motion stills. Instead, it remains alive as imperfect memory that grows with each retelling, the truth expanding rather than crystallizing. The greatest loss wasn't the missing footage, it was the missed opportunity for millions to witness not just the physical confrontation, but what came after. The teaching, the respect, the transformation of conflict into collaboration. That's the part they tried to destroy, and that's the part the witnesses made sure survived, footage or no footage. In the end, perhaps that is enough. The tape may be gone, but the lesson remains. Mastery isn't about perfecting what came before. It's about being willing to question everything, even your own assumptions, especially when you think you've found all the answers. That afternoon, in a sweltering Los Angeles training hall, proved that truth doesn't fear confrontation. It requires it. And sometimes, the moments that matter most are the ones no camera can adequately capture, preserved instead in changed minds and transformed approaches to age-old questions. The tape they tried to destroy succeeded in its destruction. But the truth it contained? That survived anyway, carried forward by people who understood that some lessons are too important to be lost just because the evidence disappeared. Perhaps that is enough.